1942, June 4, Philippine Sea, northwest of Midway, Atoll. This is a first-person war story set in World War II, 1942, above the Philippine Sea following a U.S. Navy dive bomber pilot at the Battle of Midway. You will live through a desperate search across open ocean, the slaughter of the men who flew before you, and 5 minutes where everything, the Pacific War, could become hung on a dive angle and a man's nerve. But the moment that decides everything is not a plan. It is an accident of courage and sacrifice you will never be able to repay. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened up there. I want you to understand what a flight deck looks like from 10,000 feet when you are coming straight down at it. It doesn't look like a ship. It looks like a postage stamp floating on a dark ocean. The ocean is so vast and so indifferent that the stamp barely registers. Then the stamp gets bigger. Then you start to see the lines on it, the painted markings, the crowded shapes of aircraft and men. And by the time you understand what you are looking at, you have already committed to the dive, and there is nothing left in the world but that strip of gray steel rush toward you. This is what I saw. This is what happened. And I still don't know how to explain what 5 minutes can cost. The morning of June 4th began before the sun. I was in the ready room aboard USS Enterprise by 0600. Coffee going cold in my hand, listening to the squadron commander lay out what we knew on a grease pencil chart that already looked obsolete. The intelligence was right, he said. The Japanese carrier fleet was out there. They were coming for Midway Atoll, the tiny island outpost that stood between the enemy and the open lane to Hawaii. Our codebreakers had cracked their communications. We had the jump on them. We knew where they were going. We just didn't know exactly where they were right now. And in the Pacific, that difference between knowing and exactly knowing could mean the difference between striking first and dying blind. I was a lieutenant commander, leading a dive bomber section of SBD Dauntlesses. The slow but deadly, we called them, because they weren't fast and they weren't glamorous, but they were steady as church pews in a dive, and they could put a 1,000-pound bomb through a deck plate from 12,000 feet. If you had the nerve and the angle, I had flown them for 2 years. I trusted them the way you trust something that has never killed you yet. What I did not trust that morning was the weather. The Pacific sky in early June can be a theater of contradictions. Clear and blue and brutally bright in one direction, hammered with cloud and squall in another. As we launched in the first wave of the morning, the sky ahead of us was a mixed palette. Great towers of cumulus rising white and gray to the northwest, patches of open blue scattered between them, and a wind from the east that was pushing everything, including us. At a slight drift we had to account for. I kept my eyes on my compass, on the altimeter, on the fuel gauge, and I listened for the radio voice of our scout planes, which were out ahead of us, somewhere, searching. There is something almost meditative about flying over open ocean when nothing is shooting at you. The engine is loud enough to fill the skull. The vibration of the airframe moves through your spine and your hands and your boots. And below you there is nothing, just the dark Pacific, wrinkled and heaving, stretching out in every direction without a single landmark to fix on. You navigate by clock and heading and instinct and prayer. You trust your instruments and you trust your lead, and you listen to the radio, and the radio says nothing useful for a very long time. My gunner, Petty Officer Connolly, sat behind me in the rear cockpit, his twin .30 calibers pointed Gulf, scanning the sky. He didn't talk much in the air, neither did I. We had learned that the sky and the silence were both information, and unnecessary noise was just distraction. The fuel gauge moved, the clock moved, the ocean below us stayed the same enormous, empty blue. Then our squadron leader's voice came over the radio, clipped and tight, change of heading, new vector northwest. Something had been spotted. Something was out there. I checked my fuel. I checked my bomb. I tightened my harness straps and settled my shoulders back against the seat, and I looked out at the sky ahead of us, and I thought, very clearly, whatever happens next, do not waste the altitude. The altitude is everything. The altitude is the only advantage you are going to get. I didn't know yet how right I was. I didn't know yet what the men below us, the torpedo plane, crews were about to buy for me with the only currency they had. On a Japanese carrier deck, At almost exactly that same moment, men were working as fast as they had ever worked in their lives. The morning had already gone one direction and was now being pulled back the other. Bombs were being unstaged. Torpedoes were being hoisted back. The deck was a chaos of hoses and carts and shouted orders. Aircraft sitting half-armed while the flight crews tried to manage a decision. Their command had already changed twice. The flight crews tried to manage a decision. Their command had already changed twice. Deck officers stood in the middle of it all and felt the one thing a flight deck officer cannot afford: feel uncertainty. The Japanese had the initiative that morning. They had struck Midway at dawn with a powerful first wave, and their second strike was being prepared. The carriers were fat and confident and pointed into the wind. And somewhere in all that organized chaos, the window was opening. The window that neither side could yet see. But what would it cost to climb through it? There is a room aboard a ship that most men never see. A room with no portholes and no natural light and a low ceiling strung with cables and wire, where men in headphones sit at tables, covered in charts and signal pads and coffee cups, and work in a permanent artificial twilight that has no connection to whether it is day or night on the surface of the Pacific. This is where the war was being run on June 4th. I was not in that room, but I knew the men who were, and I knew what they knew, and what they knew, and what they knew was extraordinary. They had read the Japanese signals. They had broken the code. They understood the enemy's intent before the enemy had finished transmitting it. The admiral knew where the carriers were going. He knew approximately when the strike on Midway would land. He had positioned Enterprise and Hornet and Yorktown in a triangle of ocean that the Japanese believed was empty. And he had waited. Patience is a kind of violence in war. The admiral's patience that morning was a weapon as precise as any bomb, but precision has its limits. And the limits were becoming apparent as the morning wore on. The Japanese had launched their Midway strike at dawn. The American response had to come before that second Japanese wave was airborne, rearmed, and launched, before the carriers could reset, reload, and strike at the American fleet, whose position was now slowly becoming known to the enemy. The window was not infinite. It was not even comfortable. Every minute the scouts spent searching was a minute. The Japanese decks were getting more orderly, more armed, more dangerous. I could not see any of this from 10,000 feet. What I could see was the heading given to me by my squadron leader, who had just received an updated contact report from a scout plane. The Japanese carriers were approximately 200 miles to the northwest. They were moving southeast into the wind, preparing to launch. We were on an intercept. The fuel math was already borderline. The island of Midway itself was behind us to the south, invisible now below the horizon. But earlier, from the deck of Enterprise, we had seen the smoke. The Japanese morning strike had hit the island hard. Fuel tanks were burning. Runways were cratered. The Midway-based aircraft that had tried to intercept the incoming wave had taken savage losses. The island was still operational, barely, but its fighter cover was mauled, its radar damaged, and its remaining aircraft were already in the air, scattered, trying to reorganize. The torpedo plane squadrons had launched first, ahead of us, from all three carriers. I watched them go from the flight deck, the Devastators low and ponderous, their torpedoes slung beneath them like the whole weight of what was being asked of them made physical. They flew without fighter escort, or nearly without it. The Wildcats were not enough, and the fight over Midway had already dispersed much of what we had. The torpedo planes went north in loose formation, and the sky swallowed them. I found out later what happened to them. At the time, I could only listen to the radio. The Japanese fleet moved like a machine. 4 carriers in the strike group: Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu. Each one a city of men and aircraft and fuel and ordnance, each one the center of its own cluster of destroyers and cruisers whose guns pointed outward in every direction. Combat air patrol. The Zero fighters kept in the air to protect the fleet, flew circuits above the task force in organized patterns, altitude stacked, eyes scanning. They were the best naval pilots in the Pacific. They had fought across the width of Asia and the breadth of the Pacific for 6 months without a serious setback. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was experience. But experience has one weakness. It teaches you to expect what you have already seen. What the Japanese command expected that morning was what had happened at Pearl Harbor, what had happened at Coral Sea. What had happened every time an enemy had tried to contest? Their fleet, disorganized attack, uncoordinated approach, piecemeal forces arriving without mutual support. What they expected was manageable. What they were about to receive was something else. Not because we had planned it better. Because the men who flew in first were willing to die. I was still climbing, still flying northwest, when the first garbled transmissions started coming through. Torpedo planes, contact with the fleet, going in, altitude 100 feet. The radio had that stretched, static-filled quality it got when too many signals were competing at once, voices cut off and resumed and cut off again. And beneath it all, a frequency of urgency that needed no words to translate. I looked at my fuel gauge. I looked at the compass. I looked at the empty sky ahead of me, and I pressed the engine harder, and I thought about the men below. The scout plane that changed everything was a Catalina out of Midway, big, slow, built for patrol work, not combat. And her crew had been flying search patterns since before dawn, covering the wide empty sectors to the northwest, where the contact was expected. They found the Japanese carriers at approximately 0530, and the report they sent was incomplete. Not their fault. These things happen. The radio equipment was standard, and the atmospheric were poor, and the pilot was trying to transmit while simultaneously avoiding the Zero fighters that had come up to deal with him. Because the Japanese had seen his flying boat and sent up a pair of interceptors, and the Catalina had ducked into cloud and sent what she had before the signal, degraded. What the ops room got was a partial contact, 2 carriers, possibly more, bearing this heading at this approximate range. The position was off by 25 miles. The number was wrong. The heading had a 2-degree error that over 200 miles of ocean would matter. I didn't know about the positional error when my squadron leader gave us our new heading. Didn't know about any of it. I was flying on trust. Trust in the chain of information that ran from that Catalina crew to the ops room, to the admiral, to the strike coordinator, to my squadron leader, to me. Each link had done its best. The error had still propagated. We flew northwest. The fuel gauge moved. 20 minutes passed. 30, 40. The radio traffic from the torpedo planes was becoming harder to parse. I could hear the carrier designations. Torpedo 3, Torpedo 6, Torpedo 8, and I could hear the distorted transmissions that told me they had found the fleet and were attacking. I could not hear what it was costing them. What was happening below me, at wave height, was this: the Devastator torpedo planes, low, slow, armed with weapons that had to be released from less than 1,000 yards to have any chance of tracking to target, were approaching the Japanese carriers through a gauntlet that no aircraft of their generation was designed to survive. The Zero fighters of the Combat Air Patrol came down to meet them at altitude first, then dropped to sea level to pursue, their guns precise and merciless. The anti-aircraft guns on the escort ships opened up as the torpedo planes entered range, 40mm pom-poms, 20mm cannons, 5-inch guns firing proximity fuses, filling the low air with shrapnel and tracers and pressure waves that could tear a wing off if you were close enough. The torpedo planes flew through it. Some of them, the ones that made it to release distance, let their weapons go and pulled up into whatever thin hope remained. Most of the weapons either missed or ran erratic. The Japanese carriers were turning, fast and sharp, the deck crews watching from the rail as the American attack fell apart in fire and smoke and the churned white wakes of evasive maneuvers. Torpedo 8, from Hornet 15 Devastators, was virtually wiped out. One man survived. His name was George Gay. He floated in the water for hours, watching the battle from a life raft, and what he saw in the next hour would become one of the most extraordinary eyewitness accounts in the history of the war. On the Japanese carriers, the crews were already back to work. The attack had been repelled. The torpedo planes were gone. The flight decks were crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch, some armed for ship attack, some for midway, and the hoses were still running, fuel was still pumping, and the ordnance carts were still moving. The fleet had beaten off the attack. The carrier commanders felt the satisfaction of professionals who have done exactly what they trained to do. What they did not know was that something had shifted. The Zero fighters, having come down to wave height to deal with the torpedo planes, were now at zero altitude, and zero altitude is the worst possible place to be when you need to respond to a threat from above. They could see the ocean. They could not see 12,000 feet. And at 12,000 feet, my squadron leader's voice came over the radio, tight and urgent, and he said, "Target, 3 carriers, bearing 025. Follow me down." My hand went to the dive flaps. My eyes went to the horizon, and below me, through a break in the cumulus, I saw them. 3 steel rectangles on dark water, full decks, aircraft visible, fuel hoses still connected. The window was open. We had 20 seconds before the world changed. The only question was whether we had the nerve to use it. I want to stop here and tell you what I know now that I did not know then. I want to tell you about the men of Torpedo 8 because they deserve more than a footnote in someone else's story. They were not ordered to die. They were ordered to attack. The difference matters enormously to the men who give those orders, and it matters almost nothing to the men who receive them, because the arithmetic of attacking a Japanese carrier fleet at wave height in a devastator torpedo plane in June of 1942 left very little room for the distinction. The aircraft was designed for an earlier era of naval warfare, slower, lower, requiring a long straight approach to get the torpedo into the water at the right angle and the right speed. The Zero was designed for exactly this moment to find slow aircraft at low altitude and destroy them before they could threaten the fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo 8. He had argued before launch for a different approach vector. He had pushed for better fighter cover. He had written a note to his men before the mission that suggested he understood, with some precision, what was going to happen. He was not a reckless man. He was a man who understood that the battle had its own logic, and the logic required someone to press the attack regardless of the odds, because someone needed to pin the Zero fighters to the deck and the sea. He flew north. All 15 of his aircraft flew north with him. They found the Japanese fleet before any other American unit. They attacked from the worst possible angle, at the worst possible altitude, with fighters coming down on them from above and anti-aircraft fire rising to meet them from the ships below. Waldron's aircraft was hit early and went into the water burning. The other kept coming. One by one, the devastators fell, some torn apart by fighter fire, some knocked down by flak, some simply disappearing into the churn of smoke and spray where the ocean and the battle had become the same indistinguishable thing. Ensign Gay watched his squadron die around him. He kept flying. His gunner was killed. He was hit. He released his torpedo at close range. It missed, and then his aircraft was shot down, and he went into the water and managed to inflate a life raft and pulled it over himself to hide from the Zero fighters that were still patrolling at low altitude looking for survivors to strafe. He pulled the rubber up over his face and floated in the oil-dark water and listened to the silence. Where Torpedo 8 used to be, Torpedo 3 and Torpedo 6 from Yorktown and Enterprise attacked next, in sequence with similar results. Not quite as catastrophic. Some aircraft made it back. Some crews survived, but the toll was brutal and the torpedoes again largely failed to find their targets. The Japanese carriers were fast, and the captains were experienced, and the torpedoes of the era were unreliable, and the carriers turned, and the weapons ran wide or shallow or failed to arm. But the Zero fighters were all at wave height. They had been there for the better part of an hour, coming down to deal with each successive wave of torpedo planes, burning fuel at sea level, their pilots' eyes locked on the low horizon. They were not looking up. They were not positioned to look up. And above them, undetected, arriving from the one angle the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had vacated in its urgency to deal with the torpedo planes, were the dive bombers. I heard the torpedo plane transmissions thinning out, voices dropping off one by one. I knew what that meant, even though I told myself I didn't. The radio has a particular quality when a frequency goes quiet, not static, not noise, but a specific absence, like a room where someone was just speaking, and now is not. The voices of Torpedo 8 went silent that way, one after another, and I flew northwest with the silence in my headset, and I checked the fuel, and I checked the bomb, and I kept my eyes on the sky, and I did not let myself think about what the silence meant. You make a calculation in war that you cannot make anywhere else. You take what is being offered, the window, the angle, the altitude advantage, and you use it because not using it means the sacrifice that bought it was wasted. There is no honor in hesitance when men have already paid for your moment with everything they had. You can grieve later, you can carry it forever. But right now, you have 12,000 feet and an open deck and a bomb. My hand was already on the dive flaps. My eyes were already on the carrier below. I can still smell the cockpit, the oil and the rubber and the particular dry metallic smell of altitude, the faint sourness of my own fear coming through the wool of my flight jacket. I can still feel the vibration of the engine in my hands. I can still hear Connolly behind me saying nothing, which was how I knew he was ready. The leader called it, "Push over." And I pushed over. I am going to give you this in time, because time is the only frame that makes it comprehensible. If I give it to you any other way, if I dress it in metaphor or pull the camera back to strategic distance, you will understand it as history. I need you to feel it as the 5 minutes it was. The window opened at approximately 10:22. Minute 1. The Japanese carriers Kaga, Akagi, Soryu were in the middle of deck operations. The fuel hoses had been running since before the torpedo attack, feeding the aircraft being prepared for the next strike. Bombs had been restaged on the deck rather than returned to the magazines, a decision made under time pressure, because rearming takes time, and the command wanted the next wave airborne as fast as possible. The flight decks were crowded with everything that makes a carrier useful, and everything that makes a carrier vulnerable. Fueled aircraft, armed ordnance, hoses connected to tanks that held thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline. The deck crews experienced men, dedicated men, men who were not soldiers in any traditional sense, but who had made the flight deck their entire world moved through the organized chaos with practiced efficiency. They believed they had dealt with the American attack. They believed they had time. The first SBDs appeared in their dive at an angle that the carrier's lookouts, scanning the horizon and the low sky for torpedo planes, were not positioned to find. 12,000 feet become 10,000, becomes 8,000 in the first seconds of a dive, and at that speed, even if someone sees you, the guns cannot track you fast enough. The anti-aircraft batteries on the carriers began to swing upward, but the geometry was wrong. The angle was too steep, the time too short. I was in the dive. The world had reorganized itself into a single narrow tunnel of attention. The carrier deck below, the altimeter unwinding on my instrument panel, the crosshairs of gun sight, moving in tiny corrections as my hands made adjustments, so small they felt like thought rather than action. The speed was building, 200 miles per hour, 220, 240, and the carrier was expanding below me the way a photograph expands. When you bring it close to your face, the details becoming specific and terrible. I could see aircraft on the deck. I could see the fuel hoses. I could see men running. Minute 2. The Zero fighters were at wave height. They had been there for nearly an hour. To climb from wave height to 12,000 feet takes time. Minutes, irreplaceable minutes. And they were just beginning to understand that there was something above them when the first bombs fell. Our squadron leader's bomb hit Kaga amidships. The explosion went up and then went down into the fueled aircraft on the deck, and the fueled aircraft became part of the explosion, and what had been a crowded flight deck became a vertical column of fire and black smoke that I could see clearly from my own dive angle 2 miles away. The ship did not sink immediately. Ships almost never do. But the flight deck was gone. Not damaged, not compromised, gone. And the fires that started in that first second would not go out for hours, and by the time they did, there would be nothing left of Kaga worth saving. I held my dive. I held the crosshairs. I held my nerve. Minute 3. My bomb released at 2,000 feet. I felt the aircraft jump as the weight left it. 1,000 pounds of sudden absence. The Dauntless lurching slightly upward in the fraction of a second before I pulled the stick back, and the horizon swung violently from below me to above me, and then to level, and I was pulling up into a sky that was already full of smoke and flak, and the fragments of things that had been, seconds ago, intact. I did not see my bomb hit. You rarely do. You are already pulling away, already fighting the G-forces of the recovery, already looking for the horizon and your wingmen, and the fastest way to put distance between yourself and the anti-aircraft guns that are now tracking you as you pull out. What I heard was a detonation, felt it, more than heard it, a pressure wave that moved through the airframe. And when I leveled out and banked to look back, I saw the smoke. Akagi was hit. The bomb had gone through the after section of the flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, where aircraft and fuel and ordnance were staged for launch. The secondary explosions came one after another, each one feeding the next. The stored energy of a warship, prepared for battle, turning violently inward. The flight deck buckled. The fires moved forward. The ship began to heal. Minute 4. Soryu was struck almost simultaneously. 3 bombs, at least 2 of which penetrated to the hangar deck. The pattern of destruction was the same. Staged aircraft, fuel, ordnance. Everything that makes a carrier dangerous, becoming the mechanism of its own destruction. The crew of Soryu would fight the fires for hours. They would not win. 3 carriers. 4 minutes. 3 flight decks that had woken that morning as the spearhead of the most powerful carrier force the world had ever assembled, now burning simultaneously. Their second strike still on deck, their fuel hoses still connected, their crews running toward fires. They could not fight with water or foam or courage. Minute 5. I was pulling out at 800 feet, too low, too fast. Flak bursting around me in black cotton, puffs that smelled when you flew through the edge of one of sulfur and scorched metal. Connolly had his guns pointed aft and was firing short bursts at a Zero that had managed to find altitude from somewhere. The tracers arcing backward in a red line that I could see in my peripheral vision. I rolled left, rolled right, kept the nose up, kept the engine at full throttle. Below me and behind me, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers were on fire. I was not triumphant. I want to be precise about this. I was not triumphant. I was shaking. My hands were shaking on the stick, a trembling I could not stop and could not explain, because the fear had been compressed all the way through the dive and was now releasing in whatever form it could find. And what it found was my hands. I flew north to gain distance from the fleet, and then I turned east toward the carrier, and I listened to the radio, and I thought about the voices that had gone silent. An hour ago, the men who had flown in before me and bought this window with everything they had. They had not lived to see what 5 minutes could do. I carried that with me all the way home. There was a 4th carrier. I want you to understand how easy it is, in the chaos of a carrier battle, to miscount. The Pacific is enormous. The smoke from burning ships rises to 10,000 feet and spreads on the wind, and covers square miles of ocean in a gray-brown haze that makes navigation difficult and visibility worse. Aircraft are returning from strikes and departing on searches, and fighters are climbing, and anti-aircraft fire is creating its own smoke, and the radio is a cacophony of competing transmissions, and in all of that, it is possible. It happened to believe you have struck all 4 carriers, when in fact one of them is still operational. Hiryu was to the north of the other 3, separated by several miles, and she had come through the initial attack unscathed. Her captain had seen the smoke rising from the other carriers, and he had understood instantly what had happened. And he had done exactly what a competent, experienced commander does when his fleet has taken a catastrophic blow. He had launched immediately with everything he had, without waiting, without hesitating, without worrying about coordinating with ships that were no longer able to coordinate. Hiryu sent her strike aircraft northeast toward the American carriers within an hour of the Dauntless attack. I was already on the way back to Enterprise when it happened. My fuel was low, lower than I wanted, lower than doctrine, and I was flying at reduced power to stretch what remained, listening to the radio. Give me a picture of the battle I could not see directly. The torpedo planes were still being accounted for. Recovery operations were underway. The strike had been a success. People were saying things on the radio that used words like decisive and extraordinary, and I remember listening to those words and feeling nothing in particular, because the shaking in my hands had not entirely stopped, and I was concentrating very hard on keeping the fuel gauge above 0 and the horizon level. Then the radio changed. The voice of the fighter direction officer on Enterprise, clipped, controlled, professional in the way that means something is very wrong, began vectoring fighters to a bearing that was coming from the wrong direction. From behind us, from the northeast, Hiryu's dive bombers found Yorktown. They came in coordinated, experienced, disciplined, Everything you would expect from Japanese naval aviators who had fought since the Pearl Harbor strike and had not forgotten how to press an attack under fire. 3 bombs hit. The hits were not catastrophic in the way ours had been. The ordnance did not find fuel and munitions in the same volcanic concentration, but they were severe. The fires started. The carrier slowed. Damage control teams went to work with the specific professional urgency of men who understand that a ship on fire in the middle of the Pacific is a ship that will kill you if you let it. I landed on Enterprise because Yorktown was compromised. The deck crew caught my wire and I taxied forward and climbed out of the cockpit, and my legs went unreliable on me for a moment, the way legs do after 2.5 hours of sustained tension. And I leaned against the fuselage and looked at the sky and tried to breathe normally. Around me, the ship was in controlled motion. Deck crews moving aircraft, ordnance crews, reloading dive bombers, fuel trucks threading through the organized density of flight operations. People were talking, working, checking equipment. Conley climbed out of the rear cockpit. He looked at me and he said, "You all right, sir?" And I said yes. And we both understood that neither of those sentences was exactly about what it was about. The news from Yorktown was bad, and then worse. The first wave of Hiryu's attack had left the carrier slowed in listing. The damage control teams had performed something close to a miracle, getting the fires under and restoring enough speed to resume flight operations. And then Hiryu's torpedo planes found her. 2 torpedoes, maybe 3. The torpedo is the weapon that doesn't negotiate. A bomb can damage a flight deck, but a torpedo goes below the waterline into the engineering spaces, where the sea gets in and the ship starts to lose its argument with physics. Yorktown began to list badly. The order came to abandon ship. In the water around a listing carrier there is a particular kind of terrible, the oil spreading rainbow sheets across the swells, the debris of a ship's interior made exterior by necessity. Life, rafts and lines and men in the water, helping each other to the safety that is only relative out here, because relative is all you get. Destroyers moved in to pick up survivors, their hulls coming as close as they dared to the listing carrier. The men in the water were methodical about it. They had trained for this. Being methodical is the only response to catastrophe that does not make things worse. A sailor on one of the destroyers later told me that the men coming out of the water were mostly very quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of men who have been inside something very large and very loud for a very long time, and need a moment before the world comes back. I understood exactly what he meant. We were not done either. The fleet was reforming, refueling, rearming. Hiryu was still out there, intact, and as long as she was intact, she was a threat. Not the threat of 5 minutes ago, not the fleet ending, campaign changing, war-shaping threat that 4 carriers represented, but a real threat. The threat of a ship capable of sinking American carriers and killing American sailors, and prolonging the cost of what was already the most expensive morning in the Pacific War. We needed to find her. We needed to finish it. My hands had stopped shaking. I found my next brief, checked my aircraft status, drank cold coffee, and listened to the search reports coming in. The sun was past its zenith now, past noon, moving toward the long Pacific afternoon that was still full of dying. We were not done. Not yet. They found Hiryu at 1700. A scout plane spotted her still moving northeast, still functional, her deck still intact. The one Japanese carrier out of 4 that had made it through the morning. The strike order came quickly, before the light went entirely, before whatever remained of Hiryu's operational capacity could be used again. Dive bombers from Enterprise, some of them making their second strike of the day, were launching again before the afternoon was an hour old. I was not in the second strike. My aircraft needed work. A fuel line issue that the deck crew had caught on landing inspection. The kind of thing that wouldn't kill you immediately, but would kill you eventually, and that the mechanics treated with the same urgency they treated everything else, because everything else was equally capable of killing you. I watched the second strike launch from the deck, the Dauntlesses lifting off one by one into a sky that was beginning to purple toward the west, and I felt the particular helplessness of a pilot who is grounded when there is still flying to be done. The deck was not a comfortable place to be. The ship was moving fast, zigzagging, actually, the standard anti-submarine and anti-aircraft pattern. the deck tilting slightly with each change, heading in a rhythm you could feel in your feet if you stood still long enough. The wind off the bow was strong and hot with engine exhaust from the returning aircraft, and the smell of aviation fuel was everywhere. The permanent atmosphere of a carrier at war. Crew members moved around me with the efficiency of people who have reduced everything to necessary motion, no surplus of gesture, no wasted steps. Every action connected to the next in a chain that kept the ship functional, and the aircraft flying, and the men alive. I watched a damage control team running a drill nearby. Not a real emergency, a training exercise nested inside an actual combat day. Because you keep training, because training is what saves you when the real emergency comes. They moved hoses and checked pressure fitting, and called out status in voices that were calm and professional and slightly bored with the drill because they had done it hundreds of times, and the boredom of a well-executed drill is the most reassuring sound a sailor can hear. But underneath the efficiency, there was something else, a frequency of awareness that everyone on that ship was carrying but not speaking. Yorktown was in the water, not sunk yet. She was still floating, still being circled by destroyers, still being contested, but compromised beyond recovery. Listing on her port side in the late afternoon sea, her flight deck tilting toward the water, at an angle that made everything she was built for impossible. 3 Japanese carriers were burning on the horizon to the northwest, their smoke visible from the deck of Enterprise in long, dark streaks against the lowering sky. But Yorktown was an American ship and she was dying, and there were men in the water around her, and the mathematics of the day were not as clean as the morning's extraordinary luck had made them seem. A mess attendant brought coffee. I drank it standing, watching the sky to the northwest where the second strike had gone. The radio, when Hiryu was found and struck, told the story in the usual truncated way. Contact, attack, hits reported, fires confirmed. The second strike found her with 4 bombs on the flight deck. Hiryu began to burn. Her captain, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, was offered evacuation and refused it. He stayed aboard. This is reported as a fact of the battle, and I want you to sit with what it means. A man staying with a burning ship, deliberately, because he considered the ship's loss his personal responsibility, and saw no point in surviving it. I am not asking you to admire this. I am asking you to understand that the men on the other side of the battle were not abstractions. They were serious men who took seriously what they had done and what had been done to them. The night came in fast, the way it does in the Pacific. The sun dropping through cloud on the western horizon and the darkness rising out of the east in what feels like a single continuous motion. The ocean at night under combat conditions has a particular quality. The lack of light that would normally be comforting becomes threatening, because the same dark that hides you from the enemy hides the enemy from you, and the submarine threat that is always present becomes acutely present when you cannot see beyond the bow wave. Search aircraft were still out. Destroyers were still picking up survivors. American and Japanese both. In some cases, the same ships moving through the debris fields of the burning carriers and pulling men out of the water without particular regard for their nationality, because a man in the oil-dark water of the Pacific at night is just a man in the water, and the sea does not care whose side he was on. I heard about this later from men who had been involved in it, and they described it matter-of-factly, as if it were the obvious thing to do, which perhaps it is. I found a corner of the ready room and sat down and closed my eyes and heard the ship moving through the water around me, the deep vibration of the turbines, the sound of the hull against the sea, the distant and muffled percussion of the damage control drills still going on somewhere below. I was very tired, the kind of tired that is not just physical, the kind that comes from having been compressed into a single narrow point of attention for hours and then released the way a spring releases. I thought about the torpedo planes. I thought about George Gay floating in the water. I thought about George Gay floating in the water. I thought about the Japanese deck crews who had been on those carriers at 1022, doing their jobs, and 122, doing their jobs, who were now what? I didn't let myself finish the thought. Not yet. The finishing of that kind of thought is work for later. For the long years after the war, when there is time to reckon with everything the day cost. What I knew, sitting in that ready room with the Pacific moving around me, and the battle not yet finished, was this: we had not won. Not yet. Yorktown was still dying. The Japanese fleet was still out there. Damaged but not broken. Still capable of action. Still capable of revenge. The night was full of submarines and destroyers, and the uncertainty of a battle whose final shape had not yet been determined. What I also knew, and could not quite put into words yet, was that something had shifted. Not just the tactical situation, not just the carriers burning to the northwest, but something larger and less tangible. A weight of momentum that had been moving in one direction for 6 months, and that had, in 5 minutes of a Pacific morning, changed. I didn't know how to hold both of those things at once. I didn't have to hold them yet. The night was still dark. The sea was still moving, and somewhere to the north, a Japanese fleet was regrouping in the dark. Sleep, when it came, was brief. Dawn over the Philippine Sea, June 5, 1942. The light comes in from the east, over a surface that looks, from a distance, perfectly calm. The Pacific has that quality in the early morning, before the wind builds, before the day's weather develops. A gray-silver smoothness that reflects the sky in broad, imprecise sheets. From the deck of Enterprise, watching the sun come up, you could almost believe that the ocean in front of you was empty and peaceful, and had always been so. But the debris was out there. You knew it was out there, even if you couldn't see it yet. The floating wreckage of 4 carriers, the oil slicks that spread and thinned across miles of water, the personal effects of thousands of men who had been alive 24 hours ago and were not alive now. The Pacific swallowed things with an impartiality that felt, in those early morning moments, almost like a comment on what we had done out here. Yorktown was still floating. Incredibly, stubbornly, she was still floating, still attended by destroyers, still being kept company by the men who had not been able to bring her back to operational status, but had not been willing to leave her either. A salvage party was aboard. There was some hope, briefly, that she could be saved, towed to a port, repaired, returned to the war. She had been struck, and she had not sunk. And the men who build carriers and the men who sail them tend to share a belief in the fundamental refusal of well-built ships to go quietly. She was struck by a Japanese submarine on June 6th. The torpedoes that the Japanese carrier aircraft had started. A submarine finished. Yorktown rolled over and sank in the early hours of the 7th, taking the destroyer Hammond with her, and the salvage party had to be pulled off in an emergency that added its own cost to the running total of the battle. I did not see this. By then I was on a different part of the ocean, part of the searches that continued for another day and a half as we tried to account for the remaining Japanese surface units and make sure nothing was being repositioned for another strike. The searches were mostly fruitless. The Japanese fleet was withdrawing. The 4 carrier losses had taken the offensive heart out of the operation. Without carrier air cover, Yamamoto's main body, the great battleships, the heavy cruisers, the full weight of the combined fleet, had nothing to do but exist in a tactical vacuum. Impressive in firepower and useless in the specific geometry of a carrier war where ships you cannot see can strike you from 300 miles away. He ordered the withdrawal. The planned invasion of Midway was canceled. The island remained American. The supply line to Hawaii remained intact. The war in the Pacific continued. I am going to be very careful here, because this is the place where the story wants to become something it was not. The story wants to become a story of victory, of the superior skill and courage of American airmen, of the justice of the outcome, of a battle that proved something about the character of a nation, or the favor of fortune, or the validity of the cause. All of those things may be partially true, and none of them is the whole truth, and the whole truth is what I owe to the men who are not here to tell their own version of it. The whole truth is that we won by an accumulation of factors, some of them planned and some of them accidental, and some of them the product of decisions made by men who died before they could know what those decisions had purchased. The code breakers who read the Japanese signals gave us the where and the when, but not the exact position. The torpedo planes that attacked without adequate fighter cover gave us the altitude advantage by pulling the Zero fighters low, and the cost of that advantage was most of the men who flew them. The 5 minutes that sank 3 carriers were 5 minutes that existed only because of decisions, errors, delays, and sacrifices that none of us had fully coordinated or fully intended. This is not a diminishment of what was done. It is an attempt at honesty about how it was done. War runs on the intersection of preparation and accident, and the men who survive are not always the ones who deserve to survive, and the men who die are not always the ones whose deaths were inevitable. George Gay of Torpedo 8 survived because of a rubber raft and a piece of seat cushion and the specific trajectories of bullets that morning. Waldron did not survive. The difference between them was not heroism or skill or worthiness. It was 5 inches of rubber and the angle of a Zero's gun. I thought about this on the way home. I thought about it on the ship in the days after the battle, when the accounting was being done. The aircraft losses, the ship losses, the men lost, and the numbers were presented in briefings, in the particular bloodless language that military bureaucracies use to translate human cost into manageable data. The numbers were large. They were also smaller than the Japanese numbers, and this was the measure of victory that the situation provided. The Pacific War did not end at Midway. This is important. The Japanese did not surrender after Midway, did not withdraw from the territories they had seized, did not cease to fight with the ferocity and discipline and sacrifice that characterized everything they did in those years. The war went on for 3 more years, across thousands of miles of ocean and islands and jungle and water, at a cost that dwarfs the single morning of June 4th, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The mathematics of what came after Midway is its own terrible accounting. What Midway changed was the direction, the initiative, the ability to choose where and when the next engagement would be fought, shifted from Japan to the United States. It shifted slowly and painfully, contested every inch of the way. But it shifted. The Japanese could no longer project offensive carrier power across the Central Pacific. They could no longer threaten Hawaii. They could not bring the offensive pressure that had characterized their operations since December 7th. They were, from June 4th onward, responding to American moves rather than dictating them. This is a different thing from winning. It is also not nothing. I stood on the deck of Enterprise on the morning of June 5th and watched the sun come up over the Pacific, and I thought about 5 minutes. 5 specific minutes in a specific morning in a specific patch of ocean that most people on Earth would never be able to find on a map. 5 on to map. Minutes that the men of Torpedo 8 and Torpedo 3 and Torpedo 6 had purchased with everything they had, without knowing exactly what they were purchasing, without any guarantee that the purchase would be used or that it would matter. It mattered. I wish I had a better way to say what I owe them. I have thought about it for years, in the long after of the war. In the quiet mornings that exist now where those mornings did not exist before. And the best I can do is this. I used the window. I used it as well as I knew how. I came back and they did not. And I carried that asymmetry with me across all the years that followed. The way you carry something that has no comfortable place to rest. The Pacific was calm and silver in the early light. The debris was out there somewhere. Below, the horizon, where the ocean was keeping its own indifferent accounting of what the day had cost. I watched the sun come up. I thought about 5 minutes. The direction of the war had changed, and the price of that change floated somewhere in the dark water to the northwest, beyond sight, beyond retrieval, beyond any accounting that numbers could honestly complete.